On November 3, 1834, the morning air in Harlan County, Kentucky hung thick with coal dust and the promise of profit. The town of Blackwater existed for one purpose: to extract black wealth from the Appalachian Mountains and transform it into money for men who would never descend into the darkness themselves. The auction house on Market Street was packed that Tuesday morning. Word had spread about an unusual acquisition, and curiosity had drawn a crowd larger than any the auctioneer Cornelius Hatch had seen in 15 years. Ruth Mason stood on the platform, her head level with the auctioneer's shoulders, even though he stood on a wooden crate. 6 feet 10 inches tall, nearly 280 pounds, with hands that could palm a man's head like a melon. Her face showed the characteristic features of what modern medicine would recognize as acromegaly: prominent brow, enlarged jaw, features that made observers uncomfortable in ways they couldn't articulate. In 1834, she was simply a freak, and in the economy of human slavery, freaks had value. Hatch understood this. He began not with her labor capacity, but with spectacle, inviting men forward to stand beside her for comparison, having her extend her massive hands. The crowd responded with nervous laughter and crude speculation about her origins, but their eyes showed something else: unease, as if Ruth's existence challenged some fundamental assumption about the natural order. The bidding started at $800 and climbed rapidly. Mine owners recognized practical value. Someone with Ruth's strength could do the work of 3 men. Within minutes, the price had reached $1,900, with only 2 bidders remaining: Silas Blackwood and Joseph Garrett. Blackwood had come out of curiosity, skeptical of the rumors. Seeing Ruth in person changed his calculation immediately. He saw more than a laborer. He saw an asset that could attract investors, create memorable impressions, transform business meetings. A mine owner who possessed a genuine curiosity could leverage that into competitive advantage. When Garrett bid $2,000, Blackwood raised his hand. $2,200. The room went silent. It was one of the highest prices ever paid for a single enslaved person in the county's history. Garrett turned away, defeated. The gavel came down. Sold. Throughout the entire proceeding, Ruth had remained absolutely still, her expression unchanged. When Blackwood's foreman, Samuel Pike, approached with shackles, she looked down at him with dark, unreadable eyes, but did not resist. The standard size was too small for her wrists. Pike had to adjust them. As he led Ruth toward the wagon, an elderly black woman named Esther Gray, who sold herbs at the market, muttered something that several people overheard. "That man just bought something he cannot own, something that will not be kept." At the time, it seemed like superstition. Only later would it sound like prophecy. The journey to Blackwater Mine took 3 hours through mountain roads. Ruth sat shackled in the wagon bed, staring at the landscape. Mountains layered in shadow and light, trees touched with autumn color, heavy clouds threatening rain. She gave no indication of fear or planning. To Pike, she seemed disconnected from her circumstances, as if her mind had retreated somewhere beyond reach. They arrived as the day shift ended. Workers emerging from the main shaft, faces black with coal dust, stopped and stared at the giant woman in Blackwood's wagon. Men called out to each other, pointing, their voices carrying a mixture of amazement and something darker. The mine complex sprawled across the valley. The main shaft entrance, equipment buildings, company store, bunkhouse, and a row of 6 rough cabins where enslaved workers were housed separately from white-wage laborers. Beyond these lay the coal processing area and the creek that provided water. Further still, Blackwood's stone residence stood apart, the house of a man who had achieved wealth but remained chained to its source. Pike directed the wagon to cabin 4. When he unlocked Ruth's shackles and she stood, unfolding her massive frame, the gathered workers stepped back instinctively, creating a circle of space around her. Pike was a practical man, not cruel, but absolutely committed to order. He had worked for Blackwood 8 years and knew how to maintain hierarchy. He looked up at Ruth and delivered his speech about rules, work assignments, and punishments for resistance, whipping, confinement, reduced rations, or sale to operations further south where conditions were worse. Ruth listened without visible reaction. When he asked if she understood, she nodded once. He assigned Thomas, a worn man of 40 who had survived through careful invisibility, to show Ruth her cabin. Thomas led her across the compound, acutely aware of her presence behind him like a moving wall. Inside cabin 4, 3 people stopped their activities and stared. Samuel, a young man who worked the coalface, Job, who operated ventilation equipment, and Dinah, who cooked and mended. Ruth had to duck significantly to enter. Once inside, her head nearly touched the ceiling beams. She seemed to occupy half the room simply by standing in it. Thomas pointed out her pallet in the corner, too short for her length, and explained the schedule. Wake before dawn, work until dusk, sleep. The routine varied little. Ruth moved to her pallet and sat down, the structure creaking under her weight. She folded her legs, rested her hands on her knees, and stared at the small fire burning in the fireplace. Dinah approached with water and cornbread. Ruth accepted both, nodded, consumed them without ceremony, then returned the cup. She lay down on the too-short pallet and closed her eyes. Within minutes, her breathing slowed to the deep rhythm of sleep, or what appeared to be sleep. The others whispered among themselves, speculating about where she'd come from, why Blackwood had purchased her, what work she'd be assigned. Eventually, they settled for the night, though sleep came slowly to a cabin that now housed something they didn't know how to comprehend. Outside, November darkness settled over Blackwater Mine. Mountains rose black against a slightly less black sky. In his stone house, Silas Blackwood reviewed his accounts, making notations about his newest acquisition, calculating return on investment. In cabin 4, Ruth Mason lay awake despite her closed eyes. She had been property for 29 years, sold 5 times, exhibited dozens of times, beaten, worked, used in ways that would have destroyed most people. But something in her remained unbroken, hidden deep beneath layers of compliance and silence. Tomorrow she would descend into darkness and perform whatever tasks Blackwood demanded. She would be the spectacle he had purchased, the freak whose strength would profit him. But Ruth knew something Blackwood had failed to recognize in his calculating confidence. Strength worked in multiple directions. The same force that could haul coal carts could also break things, including perhaps the structures that sought to contain it. These thoughts moved through her mind without forming conscious plans. They were geological pressures building deep underground, slow and inexorable, waiting for the moment when the weight would become too great. That moment would come. In the darkness, Ruth opened her eyes and stared at the ceiling beams above her head. She had survived 29 years by bending, by becoming still, by retreating into silence so complete that owners forgot she could think, could feel, could remember. But there was something Silas Blackwood didn't know, something none of her previous owners had discovered because they'd sold her before the pattern completed. Ruth had given birth twice before, once in North Carolina, once in Georgia. Both times, the children had been sold within months. Both times, Ruth had found ways to make her owners regret it. The North Carolina tobacco farmer had lost his barn to a fire that started in a corner where Ruth had been working alone. Investigators found nothing suspicious, but the man's fields produced poorly for 3 years afterward, and he sold his operation at a loss. The Georgia plantation master had experienced a series of accidents: a collapsed storage building, contaminated well water, equipment failures that couldn't be explained. Nothing could be traced to Ruth, who remained compliant and silent throughout. But the man had eventually sold her at a reduced price, eager to be rid of what he privately called a curse wrapped in black skin. Ruth had learned patience. She had learned that strength applied suddenly was punished, but strength applied slowly, carefully, in ways that looked like accident or misfortune, could destroy just as effectively. She didn't plan these things consciously. She simply waited, watched, and recognized opportunities when the world presented them. Tomorrow she would begin work at Blackwater Mine. She would learn its rhythms, its weaknesses, its pressures, and she would wait. In the pallet next to hers, Dinah lay awake as well, listening to the giant woman's breathing. She had been at Blackwater for 7 years, had seen workers come and go, had learned to read the subtle signs that indicated who would survive and who would break. Something about Ruth frightened her in a way that had nothing to do with size. It was the stillness, the absolute control, the sense that behind those blank eyes, something was calculating outcomes that no one else could see. Dinah pulled her thin blanket tighter and prayed, though she wasn't sure what she was praying for. Outside, the first drops of rain began to fall, tapping against the cabin's wooden roof like fingers drumming in anticipation. The Iron Woman had arrived at Blackwater Mine, and though no one knew it yet, she had brought the future with her. Ruth descended into the earth for the first time on November 4th, 1834, following Samuel Pike down a timber-reinforced shaft that dropped 300 feet into absolute darkness. The air grew colder with each step, thick with coal dust and pressure, as if the weight of stone above was a living thing aware of the men who violated it. Pike assigned her to the deepest section, a newly opened vein where the coal was richest but the conditions most brutal. The shaft was barely tall enough for ordinary men to stand upright. Ruth had to move in a permanent crouch, her massive frame folded into a space designed for smaller bodies. The work was simple and destroying. Haul coal carts from the deep tunnels to the main shaft. Each cart weighed 400 pounds when full. Standard practice assigned 2 men per cart. Ruth hauled them alone. By midday of her first shift, the other workers had stopped to watch. She moved through the tunnels in her perpetual crouch, hands gripping iron handles, legs driving forward with mechanical precision. The cart wheels shrieked against misaligned rails. Ruth's breathing stayed steady, her face expressionless, sweat cutting clean lines through coal dust. Pike observed from the main shaft entrance, making calculations in his notebook. 1 woman doing the work of 4 men. Blackwood's investment would pay for itself within 8 months. What Pike didn't see in the darkness was how Ruth paused between loads, how she placed her massive hands against support timbers and pushed slightly, testing their strength. How she studied the ceiling, the places where cracks ran through stone like veins. How she listened to the mountain's voice, the creaks and groans that indicated pressure points, weak spots, areas where the boundary between controlled extraction and catastrophic collapse was thinnest. Ruth was learning the mine's true architecture, not the official layout Pike carried, but where the mountain wanted to move, where human intervention had created instability, where everything was held together by hope and rotting timber. She filed this information away without conscious intent, the way her body had learned to duck through doorways without thinking. By the end of her first week, Ruth had become a fixture of Blackwater's deepest operations. White wage workers gave her wide berth, unnerved by her size and silence. Enslaved workers watched with a mixture of awe and resentment. Awe at her capacity, resentment that her presence made their own labor seem insufficient. Only Dinah approached her with something like kinship. On the 7th night after the evening meal, Dinah sat beside Ruth outside cabin 4. November air was sharp with coming winter, mountains dark against a sky full of stars. "You got children somewhere?" It wasn't a question. Ruth turned her head slowly. "I had 3 babies," Dinah continued, staring at the stars. "All sold before they was 5. I think about them every day." Ruth said nothing, but her stillness changed quality, became listening rather than merely silent. "You got that same look, like part of you is somewhere else, trying to reach something you can't touch." For a long moment, only wind moved through the valley. 2, Ruth said finally, her voice barely audible. "Both girls. One would be 8 now, the other 5. You know where they at?" "No." Dinah nodded. "That's the worst part, not knowing. Ruth's hands, resting on her knees, slowly closed into fists. "I remember everything about them," she said. "Every sound, every smell, the weight of them. That's all we get to keep. The remembering." "No?" Something in Ruth's tone made Dinah look at her sharply. "Not all." Ruth stood and walked back into the cabin, ending the conversation as abruptly as it had begun. 3 months passed. Winter settled over the mountains. Men descended into earth before dawn and emerged after dusk, their lungs filling with dust, their bodies wearing down under Blackwood's relentless extraction schedule. Ruth hauled coal carts through the deepest shafts, her body adapting to the perpetual crouch, her strength seemingly inexhaustible. Pike began bringing investors to the mine specifically to see her work, creating exhibitions in the tunnels where Ruth would haul double-loaded carts or lift support timbers that required 4 ordinary men. These displays were profitable. Blackwood secured 2 new investment contracts in December alone. But in January of 1835, something shifted. A new slave arrived at Blackwater, purchased at reduced price from an estate sale in Tennessee. His name was Marcus, approximately 30 years old, and he had worked coal mines most of his life. Unlike most enslaved miners driven by fear, Marcus worked with quiet competence that suggested genuine skill. He was assigned to the deep shafts where Ruth worked, operating ventilation equipment and monitoring air quality in the most dangerous sections. Marcus and Ruth never spoke during those first weeks, but they developed a wordless coordination that increased efficiency without discussion. Marcus would signal when airflow was poor, and Ruth would adjust her route. Ruth would pause when she heard the mountain groan in ways that suggested instability, and Marcus would mark those areas for reinforcement. The other workers noticed and began to rely on it. When Ruth stopped moving, they stopped. When Marcus redirected airflow, they followed. In late February, Marcus broke the silence between them. They were alone in a side tunnel during the brief midday break. Ruth sat against a support timber, eating cornbread and dried meat. Marcus approached and sat at a respectful distance. "You're from North Carolina, Piedmont region." He paused. "I'm from Tennessee. Lost my wife and daughter 3 years ago when the estate got divided up." Ruth stopped eating. "You lost children too, I can tell." "2 daughters, both sold as infants." Marcus nodded. "This place gonna kill us eventually. Maybe slow from dust, maybe fast from collapse. So the question is what we do with whatever time we got." Ruth turned to look at him fully. "I notice things," Marcus said. "I notice you testing those support timbers, watching the ceiling in shaft 4 where the cracks are getting wider, learning this mountain like you're planning something." Ruth's entire body went still in a way Marcus recognized as dangerous. "I'm not planning to tell nobody. I'm saying, if something's gonna happen, I can help. I know where Blackwood cut corners on timbering, where the pressure's building." For a long moment, Ruth said nothing. "Why?" "Because I got nothing left except time, and time in this place ain't worth much. And because if something breaks Blackwood's operation, maybe information gets out about who got sold where." It was desperate logic built on impossible hopes. But 300 feet underground, impossible hopes were the only kind available. Ruth studied his face. "Shaft 4. Main support column, eastern wall. Cracked through the base. Pike knows but hasn't replaced it. Would mean shutting down production for a week." "How bad?" "Bad enough." Marcus absorbed this. "Blackwood's bringing investors next month. Big group from Louisville. He'll take them down to Shaft 4 personally. Show them the deep operations." Ruth's eyes flickered with something that might have been interest. "When?" "Didn't say exactly, but it's planned for mid-March when the delegation arrives." Ruth nodded slowly, then stood. "I need to get back to work." As she turned away, Marcus spoke once more. "Accidents happen in mines all the time. Nobody can prove nothing if it looks like the mountain just decided to move." Ruth said nothing, just continued walking toward the main shaft, her massive frame disappearing into deeper darkness. Marcus sat alone, wondering if he'd just agreed to something that would save them or damn them. Above, The mountain creaked and groaned, shifting enormous weight against timber supports. The weight was always there, always pressing. It just needed the right excuse to fall. March arrived with unexpected warmth. The Louisville investors were scheduled for March 19th, chosen because that week's production reports looked particularly strong. Silas Blackwood spent days in aggressive preparation. Buildings whitewashed, equipment polished, slave quarters inspected. He met with Pike daily, reviewing the route through the mine that would showcase its depth and profitability. The plan was to descend to Shaft 4, the deepest section, where the coal vein was richest. Blackwood would demonstrate operational efficiency, show how his specialized labor force extracted more coal with fewer workers, and seal agreements funding the next expansion phase. Ruth would be the centerpiece. Pike informed her on March 17th that she would perform a special hauling exhibition during the investor visit. Double-weighted cart through the most challenging section of Shaft 4 while investors observed. Ruth nodded and said nothing. That evening, she and Marcus met briefly near the creek, ostensibly filling water buckets. "During the demonstration, I'll be hauling past that support column," Ruth said, barely above a whisper. Marcus nodded. "I'll be at my ventilation station. When it happens, I'll guide airflow toward the safe exits. And after, I'll be as surprised as everyone else." They separated without another word. Above them, stars emerged in a clear sky. The kind of beautiful evening that made it easy to forget men were dying underground, extracting wealth they would never benefit from. But Ruth never forgot. She carried every injustice, every humiliation, every loss in some deep chamber that had been filling for 29 years. Soon, that chamber would overflow. March 19th dawned clear and cold. The Louisville investors arrived mid-morning in 3 carriages, 7 men in expensive coats who looked at the mine complex with the calculating eyes of people who saw only numbers and potential returns. Blackwood greeted them personally, his manner combining deference and confidence. He led them through the surface operations first, the processing area, the equipment storage, the company store. He saved the descent for last, building anticipation. At noon, they gathered at the main shaft entrance. Blackwood, Pike, the 7 investors, and 2 foremen who would serve as guides. They carried oil lamps that cast dancing shadows on the timber walls as they descended. The temperature dropped. The air thickened. The investors' conversation faded as they moved deeper, replaced by the sound of their own breathing and the distant percussion of pickaxes against stone. Ruth was in Shaft 4 when she heard them coming. She had positioned herself carefully, hauling a cart past the cracked support column on the eastern wall. The column that Pike had noted in his reports but hadn't replaced, because shutting down this section for repairs would cost a week's production. The column that had been bearing too much weight for too long. She could hear Blackwood's voice echoing through the tunnels, enthusiastic and proud, explaining the mine's depth, its rich veins, its innovative labor practices. She could hear the investors' questions, their impressed murmurs as they observed the operation. Then they rounded the corner into the section where Ruth worked. Blackwood's lamp illuminated her massive frame, bent in permanent crouch, hands gripping a cart loaded with twice the standard weight. He gestured toward her with obvious satisfaction, beginning his prepared speech about specialized labor and exceptional capacity. Ruth straightened slowly, unfolding to her full height in a rare section of tunnel tall enough to accommodate her. The investors stepped back instinctively. Even in the dim lamplight, her size was overwhelming. Blackwood was explaining the economics, the return on investment, the innovative thinking that had led him to acquire such an asset. His voice carried that particular pride of a man showing off his most valuable possession. Ruth looked directly at him. For 3 months, she had kept her eyes down, her expression blank, playing the role of the docile giant who existed only to serve. But now, in this moment, she held Blackwood's gaze with an intensity that made him falter mid-sentence. In her eyes, he saw something that sent cold understanding down his spine. This wasn't the blank stare of property. This was calculation, intelligence, purpose, and recognition of what was about to happen. Ruth took one step toward the cracked support column. Her foot came down hard, sending vibrations through the tunnel floor. The column groaned, a deep, wooden sound like the earth clearing its throat. Blackwood's face went pale. "Stop! Don't move!" Ruth took another step, heavier this time, deliberate. The column cracked audibly. Dust began to fall from the ceiling. "Get back!" Pike shouted, grabbing Blackwood's arm. "Everyone out, now!" But it was already too late. Ruth placed both massive hands against the failing column and pushed. Not hard, not violently. Just steady, inexorable pressure applied exactly where the wood was weakest. The column split with a sound like a cannon shot. For one suspended moment, nothing happened. The investors stood frozen. Blackwood stared at Ruth in horrified comprehension. Pike reached for his lamp as if light could somehow stop what was coming. Then the ceiling began to fall. Not all at once, not dramatically. The mountain moved the way mountains do, with patient, crushing inevitability. Timber supports shrieked as weight shifted onto them. Stone cracked with sounds like bones breaking. The air filled with dust so thick it extinguished half the lamps immediately. Ruth was already moving, her massive frame navigating the collapsing tunnel with the knowledge she'd spent 3 months acquiring. She knew which supports would hold longest, which passages would stay clear, which direction led to safety. She moved away from the Louisville investors and their expensive coats, away from Pike with his notebook full of calculations, away from Silas Blackwood, who had paid $2,200 for something he thought he could own. Behind her, she heard screaming, the sound of men trapped by choices they'd made, by systems they'd benefited from, by the mountain they'd violated for profit finally taking its reckoning. She felt the tunnel shake as the main collapse spread, heard the roar of tons of stone and timber dropping into the space where, moments before, men had stood admiring their own cleverness. Ruth didn't look back. She emerged into the main shaft just as Marcus began redirecting airflow, creating pressure that pushed other workers toward safe exits. His eyes met hers for one brief moment. No words, just acknowledgement of something completed. Then she continued upward, following the shaft toward daylight, toward the surface, toward whatever would come next. When she emerged from the mine entrance, other workers were already gathering, confused by the sounds from below, uncertain what had happened. Ruth walked past them without pause, her stride purposeful, her face expressionless. No one tried to stop her. She was covered in coal dust and stone fragments, her massive frame moving with such determination that stepping in front of her seemed impossible. She walked across the mine complex, past the equipment buildings, past the company store, past Blackwood's stone house with its glass windows. She walked past the slave quarters where Dinah stood in the doorway of cabin 4, watching her go with an expression that mixed terror and something like vindication. Ruth walked to the creek, and then beyond it, toward the tree line where the mountains rose dark and infinite. Behind her, chaos erupted at the mine entrance as the extent of the collapse became clear. Men shouting, running, organizing rescue attempts. The sound of picks and shovels attacking stone, trying to reach whoever might still be alive in the buried sections. But Ruth didn't hear any of it. She had already disappeared into the forest, moving with surprising speed for someone her size, following paths only she could see. By the time they realized she was gone, she had a 30-minute lead. By the time they organized a pursuit, she had vanished completely. The Iron Woman of Blackwater Mine had walked into the wilderness, and the wilderness had swallowed her whole. 3 days later, they finally reached the collapsed section of Shaft 4. They found Silas Blackwood and Samuel Pike crushed beneath several tons of stone, their bodies barely recognizable. 4 of the 7 Louisville investors were dead. 2 had survived with severe injuries. 1 was unaccounted for, presumably buried too deep to recover. The official report, filed by the county magistrate, attributed the collapse to structural failure resulting from inadequate support in a section of tunnel known to have pressure issues. It noted that the mine owner had been warned about the failing column but had postponed repairs for economic reasons. No mention was made of Ruth. No mention of how a support column under stress for weeks had chosen that exact moment to fail. No mention of the enslaved woman who had disappeared the same day 17 men were buried alive. But the workers knew. The enslaved people at Blackwater knew. And in the weeks and months that followed, the story spread through the network of mines and plantations that formed the backbone of Kentucky's extractive economy. The story of a woman who had been bought and sold like livestock, who had been worked to exhaustion and displayed like a curiosity, who had learned the architecture of her prison so thoroughly that she knew exactly how to break it. The story of the Iron Woman who had brought the mountain down on the men who thought they owned her, and then walked away. The search for Ruth Mason lasted exactly 11 days. County Sheriff William Mercer organized the pursuit with grim efficiency, understanding that failure to capture an escaped slave who had killed white men would set a precedent he couldn't afford. He assembled 12 men, professional slave catchers from Tennessee, local trackers who knew the mountain wilderness, and several Blackwater miners motivated by the substantial reward Blackwood's estate had posted. $500 for Ruth's capture, dead or alive. They began at the tree line where witnesses last saw her disappear on the afternoon of March 19, 1835. The trackers found her trail immediately. A woman of Ruth's size left impressions in soft forest soil that a child could follow. Boot prints pressed deep into creek mud, broken branches at heights no normal person could reach, disturbed undergrowth marking a path heading northeast into the most rugged section of the Cumberland Mountains. For 3 days, the trail remained clear and the pursuit confident. Ruth was moving fast, but seemingly without strategy, following straight lines rather than doubling back or using water to hide her scent. She appeared to be simply running, panicked, making the mistakes that would lead to inevitable capture. Sheriff Mercer found this encouraging. Speed over strategy meant exhaustion, failed judgment, success. On the 4th day, the trail entered forest so dense the dogs began to struggle. Ancient trees blocked sunlight, creating permanent twilight where ground was soft with decades of fallen leaves. But the trail continued, still heading northeast, still moving fast. On the 5th day, everything changed. The lead tracker, a weathered man named Cyrus Boone, who had hunted fugitive slaves for 20 years, stopped at a creek crossing and stared at the ground with an expression that made Mercer uneasy. The boot prints, consistently deep and clear for days, had suddenly become shallow. The stride length shortened, and most troubling, they multiplied, as if Ruth had walked back and forth across the same ground, creating deliberate confusion. Boone knelt, examined the tracks, then stood and scanned the surrounding forest. "She ain't panicking," he said quietly. "She's been playing us." The first 3 days, Boone explained, Ruth had laid an obvious trail to pull them deep into the mountains, away from settlements and roads, into terrain that favored wilderness survival. Now she was obscuring her movements, using techniques that suggested either prior experience or remarkable instinctive understanding. The trail split at the creek. Boot prints headed in 3 different directions, each looking equally fresh. Mercer divided his party. They would follow each track for 2 hours, then return to report. All 3 groups came back with the same story. The trails ended abruptly in rocky areas, or doubled back in ways that made actual direction impossible to determine. One tracker found prints leading directly into a thorn thicket too dense for any human to penetrate. Another found tracks that approached a cliff face and simply stopped. This wasn't panic. This was deliberate misdirection. On the 6th day, they found Ruth's boots. Both of them placed carefully on a flat rock beside a small waterfall, as if left intentionally. The same boots witnesses had seen her wearing when she left Blackwater, which meant Ruth was now moving through the mountains barefoot. Boone examined them with growing unease. A woman of Ruth's size, traveling barefoot through terrain filled with sharp rocks and thorns, should leave even more obvious signs: blood, disturbed ground, clear evidence of struggle. They found nothing. No tracks, no blood, no indication of direction. It was as if Ruth had simply dissolved into the forest itself. The search party spent 3 more days in increasingly desperate attempts to pick up her trail. The dogs, which had followed Ruth's scent reliably for nearly a week, suddenly seemed unable to track anything. They would circle the area where the boots were found, whining in confusion, refusing to commit to any direction. On the 9th day, 2 of the slave catchers refused to continue. They reported that the pursuit had become unnatural, that the forest itself seemed to be working against them, that Ruth Mason wasn't an ordinary fugitive. Mercer dismissed this as superstition, but he couldn't deny the evidence. They had been tracking Ruth through terrain that should have trapped her, and she had evaded 12 experienced men with dogs and weapons. On the 11th day, the decision was made to abandon the active pursuit. The search party returned to Harlan County empty-handed, their failure creating exactly the precedent Sheriff Mercer had feared. An enslaved woman had killed her owner and escaped, and the full apparatus of legal authority had been unable to bring her to justice. The reward remained posted. Slave catchers throughout Kentucky, Tennessee, and Virginia were notified. But the organized search ended in acknowledged defeat. Ruth Mason had disappeared. 6 months later, in September of 1835, a Quaker woman named Elizabeth Garrett, who operated a station on the Underground Railroad in southern Ohio, wrote in her diary, "A most remarkable woman stayed at our house last night. She arrived after dark, alone, and asked only for information about routes north to Canada. She was of extraordinary stature, perhaps 7 feet in height, with a bearing that commanded respect despite her tattered clothing and obvious hardship. She would not give her name, but when I asked where she had come from, she said only, 'Kentucky, the mines.' I offered her shelter for several days, but she insisted on leaving before dawn. As she departed, she asked if I had heard reports of children sold from Kentucky to Tennessee in recent years, specifically 2 girls, sold as infants. I told her I would inquire through our network. She thanked me and disappeared into the darkness. There was something both deeply wounded and utterly unbreakable in her presence. Whether this woman was Ruth Mason cannot be verified, but in the 18 months following the Blackwater collapse, Underground Railroad operators in Ohio reported a surge of arrivals who claimed they had been helped by someone who knew the wilderness routes better than any guide they had encountered before. And several plantation owners in Kentucky and Tennessee reported mysterious incidents that echoed the pattern of Ruth's earlier history. Unexplained fires, contaminated wells, structural failures, all occurring at operations known for particularly brutal treatment of enslaved workers, all impossible to trace to any specific person. In the winter of 1836, Marcus was sold away from Blackwater Mine. The operation had never recovered from the March collapse. Blackwood's death and the loss of investor confidence had created financial chaos that forced the estate into bankruptcy. The new owners liquidated most of the enslaved workforce. Marcus was purchased by a coal operation in eastern Tennessee. He worked there for 6 months before escaping in July of 1836, joining 5 other runaways attempting to reach Ohio. They were lost in the mountain wilderness for 3 days, supplies exhausted, when they encountered a woman at a creek crossing just before dawn. She was barefoot, dressed in clothes assembled from multiple sources, and she stood nearly 7 feet tall. Marcus recognized her instantly. Her face was leaner, hardened by months of wilderness survival. Her hands carried the scars of living without shelter. But her eyes were the same, dark, intelligent, carrying that quality of patient determination he remembered from the deep shafts of Blackwater. "Ruth," he said quietly. She nodded. The other runaways stared with a mixture of fear and hope. Stories of the giant woman who helped escapees had reached even their remote Tennessee operation. Ruth assessed their condition with practical eyes. Then, without speaking, she gestured for them to follow and began walking north. For 3 days, she led them through the mountains along paths that seemed to appear only when she walked them. She showed them which plants could be eaten, which water sources were safe, how to move without leaving tracks. At night, she would disappear for hours, returning with food, wild vegetables, sometimes a rabbit she had trapped. She spoke rarely, never about herself. When others asked where she had been, how she had survived, what happened at Blackwater, she would simply look at them and say nothing. But on the third night, when the others slept and Marcus sat watch, Ruth sat beside him in the darkness. For a long time, neither spoke. "Your daughter," Ruth said finally. "The one sold from the Tennessee estate. I asked about her." Marcus turned sharply. "A Quaker woman in Ohio keeps records. She found information." "Where?" Marcus's voice was barely a whisper. "Sold to a family in northern Alabama. Still there as of 6 months ago, working as a house servant." Marcus felt something break open in his chest, hope and grief mixing into an emotion he couldn't name. "How did you—" "I've been asking, at every station, every safe house, every contact along the railroad, asking about children sold from specific places in specific years." She paused. "Haven't found mine yet. But I keep asking." Marcus understood then what Ruth had become in the years since Blackwater. Not a fugitive hiding from pursuit, but someone who had transformed her escape into mission, who moved through the wilderness not just to survive, but to actively undermine the system that had tried to destroy her. "The collapse," Marcus said carefully. "Do you regret it?" Ruth was silent for a long moment. 17 men died that day. Some deserved it. Some were just trying to survive, same as us. She turned to look at him. "But Blackwood paid $2,200 for me like I was livestock, displayed me like an animal. And he would have kept doing it until the mine killed me or I became too broken to be profitable. So no, I don't regret that he's dead. I regret that others got caught in it, but I don't regret that he's dead." It wasn't forgiveness or justification. It was simply truth, acknowledged without pretense. The next morning, Ruth led them to a barn on the edge of a small farm in southern Kentucky. A free black family lived there, part of the Underground Railroad network, and they would take the group the rest of the way to Ohio. Ruth did not enter the barn. She stood at the tree line, already preparing to disappear back into the wilderness. Marcus approached her before she left. "Thank you." Ruth nodded. "Will I see you again?" "Maybe, if you keep moving north, if you help others when you can, if you ask questions about missing children and share what you learn." She paused. "The network is bigger than any of us, but every piece of information, every person helped, it all matters." Then she turned and walked back into the forest, her massive frame disappearing among the trees as if she had never been there at all. Marcus watched her go, understanding that he had witnessed something he would spend the rest of his life trying to explain. Not just a woman escaping slavery, but someone who had transformed survival into resistance, who had refused to accept that her escape was enough when others remained trapped. He never saw Ruth again, but he carried the information about his daughter to Ohio, and eventually, years after the war ended, he found her. She was alive, free, and had children of her own who would never know bondage. When he told them the story of how he learned where to find their mother, he always began the same way. There was a woman called the Iron Woman of Blackwater Mine. The documented sightings of Ruth Mason continued sporadically for years, but they became increasingly difficult to verify. In some accounts, she was a guardian spirit. In others, a monster used to justify harsher controls. The white communities and black communities told fundamentally different stories about the same woman, each version serving different purposes. But after 1843, the reports ceased almost entirely. Most historians believe Ruth died in the wilderness sometime in the mid-1840s, her body never found. The harsh reality of living without shelter, without regular food, without medical care made long-term survival unlikely even for someone of her extraordinary strength. There is, however, one piece of evidence that suggests a different possibility. In 1889, A physician in Detroit named Dr. Jonathan Hayes was treating an elderly black woman in the charity ward of his hospital. She was dying of pneumonia, and in her final days, she asked to speak with him privately. The woman told Dr. Hayes that her mother had been an escaped slave from Kentucky who had lived in the wilderness for many years before eventually making it north. Her mother had been a woman of extraordinary size who had killed a mine owner and escaped into the mountains in 1835. She said her mother had searched for her first two daughters, children sold away as infants, for over 15 years, following leads that almost always ended in disappointment. She never found them. But in her searching, in her years moving through the Underground Railroad network, she had helped hundreds of others escape. In 1851, the woman said, her mother had met another escaped slave in Ohio, a man who had also lost children to sales. They had built something like a life together, had a daughter, the woman now dying in Detroit. Her mother had taken the name Sarah Freeman and had lived quietly in Michigan until her death in 1867. The woman herself died 2 days after telling Dr. Hayes this story. He recorded it in a letter to a colleague, noting that he found the account remarkable but impossible to verify. The letter was discovered in 2006 by a historian researching Underground Railroad activities in the Midwest. Death records for Sarah Freeman, filed in Detroit in 1867, list her height as exceptional and note that she died of natural causes at an estimated age of 62 years. If Ruth Mason was born around 1805, she would have been 62 in 1867. What we know with certainty is this. On March 19, 1835, 17 men died in a mine collapse at Blackwater, Kentucky. On the same day, an enslaved woman named Ruth Mason disappeared and was never captured. In the years that followed, reports of a woman matching her description appeared throughout the South, often connected to successful escapes or mysterious incidents at brutal plantations. Whether Ruth died in the wilderness or lived to old age in Michigan cannot be answered with certainty. What remains is what she did in that library at Blackwater, in those tunnels where she learned the mountain's architecture, in that moment when she placed her hands against a failing support column and pushed. One woman who refused to accept that her bondage was permanent, who learned the structure of her prison so thoroughly she could destroy it, who transformed her escape into something larger than personal survival. Ruth Mason's story spread through enslaved communities as both inspiration and warning. For the men who profited from slavery, who convinced themselves that the people they owned were property incapable of complex thought, her story whispered a different truth. The woman you bought might be learning, watching, remembering, and when she decides she has nothing left to lose, she will bring your world down on your head. Then she will walk into the wilderness, and you will never find her. In the mountains of eastern Kentucky, where Ruth Mason disappeared in 1835, hikers sometimes find old trails that don't appear on any map. Historians researching the Underground Railroad occasionally discover references to a woman of unusual size who guided runaways through the Cumberland Gap. And sometimes, in the deepest parts of the forest, there are rock cairns, careful stacks of stones that mark nothing obvious, that serve no clear purpose. Evidence that someone passed through that wilderness and survived. Evidence that someone refused to be erased. Whether Ruth Mason lived for months or decades after her escape, we will never know with complete certainty. But her story endures. The Iron Woman of Blackwater Mine, who brought the mountain down, who walked into the wilderness and became the wilderness itself, who lived and died on her own terms, answering to no one, owned by nothing except the wild mountains that gave her shelter. That is the legacy of Ruth Mason. Not the violence, though that too is part of the story. Not the brutality of her enslavement, though that cannot be forgotten. But the simple, profound fact of her refusal. One woman, one moment of decision, one support column pushed until it broke, and everything that followed.